When were you sure you were about to lose your best friend? Zoe showed up at my door with a black eye and said today was the day we were getting her things from her dad's house while he was at work. I'd been begging her to leave for months, ever since he broke her wrist, and seeing her face all swollen made me want to kill him myself. We drove to her house in silence, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, both of us knowing we had maybe 2 hours before his shift ended. The house reeked of beer and cigarettes, bottles everywhere, and I kept checking the window every few seconds while we threw her clothes into garbage bags. My heart stopped when I heard his truck pull up outside, that broken muffler sound I'd learned to fear. Zoe made this horrible whimpering noise, and I knew we were screwed because her dad was already stumbling toward the front door, drunk in the middle of his workday. He crashed through the door and saw us with the bags, and his face went purple with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared, spit flying from his mouth. I tried to explain, but my voice came out shaky and scared, which made me hate myself because I'd promised Zoe I'd protect her. He slammed the door behind him so hard the walls shook, trapping us. And when Zoe tried to reason with him, he backhanded her so hard she hit the wall and slid down it. I screamed and caught her before she hit the floor, blood from her nose soaking my shirt, and suddenly I was angrier than scared. He smashed a beer bottle against the doorframe and came at us with the jagged neck. "Nobody steals from me," he said, and I pushed Zoe behind me even though my legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. We backed into the kitchen and he followed, taking his time, enjoying our fear. He slashed the bottle across my arm when I tried to shield Zoe, the glass cutting deep, hot blood immediately running down to my fingers and dripping on the linoleum. The pain was incredible, but it made everything clear. He was really going to kill us this time. I grabbed a pan from the stove and swung at his head, but he ducked and I only clipped his shoulder, making him stumble but not stopping him. He punched me in the stomach so hard I dropped to my knees gasping, unable to breathe, my vision going black at the edges. While I was down, he kicked me in the ribs and I felt something crack, white-hot pain shooting through my chest, tasting blood in my mouth. Through tears and pain, I saw Zoe grab a knife from the counter and my heart stopped because I knew this would make everything worse. He caught her wrist as she swung and they struggled, him twice her size, twisting her arm until something popped and she screamed, the knife clattering across the floor. I managed to dial 911 with bloody shaking fingers, sobbing our address to the dispatcher who kept asking me to repeat myself while he dragged Zoe by her hair through the kitchen. She was clawing at his hands, her feet scrambling for purchase on the blood-slicked floor, crying and begging him to let go. He threw her onto the back porch so hard the screen door came off its hinges. He picked up the knife and followed her outside, standing over her while she tried to crawl away, saying she'd never embarrass him again, that he'd raised her, and this was how she repaid him. I forced myself up despite the stabbing pain in my ribs, my left arm useless and bleeding, and grabbed a shovel leaning against the wall. I swung it with everything I had left and hit him across the back, but he barely flinched, turning and punching me in the face so hard I saw stars and felt my nose break. Blood poured into my mouth and I staggered backward, the world spinning. The sirens were so faint, like they were coming from another city, another world where help actually arrived in time. He pressed the knife to Zoe's throat and she was begging, "Daddy, please, I love you, please don't do this. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Her voice was so small and broken, and I knew I had one chance left. I threw myself at him with everything I had, and we crashed through the porch railing, splinters of wood flying everywhere as we fell into the yard. He landed on top of me with all his weight, driving every bit of air from my lungs, my broken ribs screaming in agony. He still had the knife and raised it above my chest while I was paralyzed, unable to breathe. I caught his wrists, but he was so much stronger, and the blade kept coming down, inch by terrible inch, my arms shaking with the effort of holding him back. I could hear myself screaming, but it sounded far away, like someone else's voice, like I was already floating outside my body watching this happen. Zoe was trying to pull him off, but her broken wrist made her weak, and he elbowed her in the face, sending her sprawling in the dirt. The knife tip touched my chest and I felt it pierce my shirt, then my skin, just breaking through, a sharp point of pain that promised so much worse to come. I looked into his eyes and saw nothing human there at all, just rage and alcohol and years of violence that would end with us dead in his backyard. My arms were giving out, muscles burning and failing, the blade sinking deeper, and the siren still sounded miles away, and I knew the cops wouldn't make it in time. The blade pushed another inch into my chest, and I felt hot blood spreading under my shirt, soaking into the dirt beneath me. Tony Burnett's voice suddenly boomed from the gate, demanding he drop the knife right now. Zoe's dad jerked his head up at the sound, and that gave me just enough slack to roll sideways as 2 officers rushed into the backyard with their weapons drawn. The knife slipped out of my chest as I moved, and the pain was so bad I almost passed out, but I kept rolling away from him. Everything happened so fast after that, with the taser hitting Zoe's dad square in the back, and his whole body going stiff before he dropped like a sack of rocks. Tony tackled him while he was down, and got the cuffs on him while another officer called for ambulances on his radio. Zoe crawled over to me through the dirt, and blood was still coming out of her nose in this steady stream that scared me more than my own wounds. The paramedics showed up and started working on me right there in the dirt, while more cops dragged Zoe's dad away, and he was screaming that we'd pay for this, and he'd kill us both when he got out. They kept asking me questions about where it hurt, and could I move my fingers, but all I could focus on was making sure someone was helping Zoe too. I watched them put a splint on her wrist and check her head where he'd hit her, and she kept trying to tell them she was fine even though she obviously wasn't. They loaded me into the ambulance first, and this nurse named Alana Crawford cut my shirt away with scissors to look at the knife wound. She told me I was lucky because it missed the major organs, but I'd need stitches and probably a bunch of tests to make sure nothing internal was damaged. All I could think about was whether Zoe was okay in the other ambulance behind us, and I kept asking Alana if she knew anything, but she just kept working on my chest. At the emergency room, they wheeled me past Zoe on her gurney, and we grabbed each other's hands for just a second before they took us in different directions. Her face was so swollen I could barely see her eyes, and she was crying and saying she was sorry over and over like any of this was her fault. They took me to this trauma room where Alana started stitching up the knife wound while another nurse cleaned all the other cuts. She listed everything out loud for someone typing on a computer, and it was worse than I thought, with broken ribs and maybe a concussion, and all these defensive wounds on my arms, plus that deep glass cut that needed its own set of stitches. Alana kept taking pictures with this special camera for evidence and telling me how brave I was, but I just felt empty and tired and everything hurt, so bad I wanted to cry. Detective Elliot Griffith showed up while I was still in the hospital bed and asked if I could give a statement about what happened. I told him everything while he recorded it on this little device, and my voice kept shaking when I got to the part about the knife going into my chest. He asked about the months before today, and I explained about Zoe's broken wrist, and all the other times her dad hurt her, and how I'd been trying to get her to leave. Maya Dominguez from Social Services came in next and started talking about where Zoe would go since she couldn't go back home. She explained that Zoe would need emergency foster care starting tonight, and I started crying because we'd never been apart after something this bad, and I didn't know how she'd handle it alone. Maya said she understood, but the state had rules about placement, and they had to find somewhere safe immediately. She promised they'd try to find a good family who understood trauma, but that didn't make me feel any better about Zoe being with strangers. They finally let me see Zoe before they discharged me, and she was so drugged up from the pain meds she could barely keep her eyes open. Her wrist was in this big white cast, and there were bandages on her face, and she looked so small in that hospital bed. I held her good hand and promised we'd get through this together, but she just stared at the ceiling and whispered that she was sorry she got me hurt, and nothing I said could convince her it wasn't her fault. My mom Piper showed up to take me home, and the second she saw my bandages and bruises, she started crying, so hard the nurse had to get her tissues. She kept touching my face real gentle like she was afraid I'd break, and asking if I was sure I was okay to leave. The drive home was mostly quiet, except for her asking if I was hungry, and that's when I realized I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast the day before. She said she'd make whatever I wanted, but I couldn't even think about food with everything that happened. The pain meds they gave me were making everything fuzzy, but I couldn't stop thinking about Zoe alone with strangers and her dad out there somewhere, probably making bail soon. Mom helped me up the stairs to my room, and I saw she'd already set up the couch with extra pillows and blankets, like she knew I wouldn't be able to lie flat with the broken ribs. She sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand while I tried not to cry about leaving Zoe at the hospital. That first night, I couldn't close my eyes without seeing the knife coming down toward my chest over and over again. I kept reaching for my phone on the nightstand every few minutes to check if Zoe had texted, but the screen stayed dark, and Maya had told us no contact for the first 24 hours, while they sorted everything out with emergency placement. The pain meds made me dizzy, but didn't stop the memories from playing on repeat, and I kept touching the bandages on my chest to make sure I was really alive and not bleeding out in that backyard. My mom came in around 3 in the morning when she heard me crying and sat on the couch next to me rubbing my back, but we didn't talk because what was there to say about almost getting murdered? The next morning, Maya called while I was trying to eat toast without throwing up from the pain medication. She said Zoe was in a youth shelter across town and doing okay physically with her wrist in a proper cast now, and they were monitoring her concussion symptoms. Then she mentioned that Zoe's dad had already made bail yesterday afternoon, and my whole body went cold, and I dropped the phone, which made my ribs scream when I bent to pick it up. Maya kept talking about how the shelter had good security and staff trained in domestic violence situations, but all I could think about was him out there somewhere, probably drunk and angry and planning what to do next. Tony Burnett showed up at our house that afternoon in his regular clothes instead of his uniform and helped me fill out paperwork for an emergency protective order. He explained it was just a piece of paper, but if Zoe's dad violated it, they could arrest him immediately without waiting for another crime to happen. His hands were gentle, helping me sign with my bandaged arm, and he wrote his personal cell number on a card telling me to call anytime, day or night, if I saw that truck or felt unsafe. 2 days later, we all had to go to the courthouse for the emergency hearing about a longer restraining order, and my mom had to help me get dressed because I still couldn't lift my arms without crying. The courthouse metal detector went off from the staples in my chest wound, and the security guard's face went white when I lifted my shirt to show him why. We had to wait in this cold hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, and I kept looking around for Zoe, but Maya said we couldn't sit together since we were both witnesses. When they finally brought Zoe in, she looked so small in clothes that weren't hers from the shelter, and her face was still swollen and yellow with old bruises. We made eye contact for just a second before they led her to the other side of the courtroom, and she tried to smile, but it came out wrong and broken. Then they brought her dad in through a different door, and my whole body started shaking so bad that Dana Wilcox, the victim advocate, had to grab my arm and help me to my seat. He was wearing a suit and had shaved and was trying to look respectable, but I could still see the monster who held that knife over me, and I thought I might throw up right there in court. Zoe wouldn't even turn her head to look at him and kept her eyes on her lap while her shoulders shook with silent crying. The judge looked at the hospital photos that the prosecutor showed her, and I watched her face get harder with each picture of our injuries. Zoe's dad's lawyer started arguing about parental rights, and how this was a family matter that got out of hand. But the judge cut him off after seeing the picture of my chest wound with the ruler next to it, showing how deep the knife went. She granted a full-year restraining order with no contact, including through third parties, and said if he came within 500 feet of either of us, he'd be arrested on the spot. After court, Dana took us to a small room and explained that the criminal case would take months, maybe even a year, and asked if we were willing to testify if it went to trial. Zoe started crying harder and said she didn't know if she could sit in front of him and tell strangers what he did, and I realized this was so much worse for her because he was still her dad, and part of her probably still loved him despite everything. Maya showed up and said she'd arranged for Zoe to stay with us temporarily, while they looked for a good foster placement since the shelter was only for 72-hour holds. My mom agreed right away, and said she'd already bought an air mattress for my room, and cleaned out half my closet for Zoe's things, which made Zoe smile for real for the first time since the attack. That first week living together, we developed this whole routine of checking every lock 3 times before bed, and mapping out safe routes to the school that avoided her old neighborhood, and keeping Tony's number on speed dial. Neither of us could sleep through the night, and we'd both jump and grab each other whenever a car door slammed outside, or we heard footsteps on the porch, even though it was usually just the mail carrier. We'd lie awake whispering about stupid stuff like homework and TV shows because talking about what happened made it too real, and we were both trying to pretend things could be normal again. School became this whole complicated thing because everyone knew what happened from the news, and they all treated us like we were made of glass that might shatter if they said the wrong thing. Some kids would come up and ask these invasive questions about the attack like we were some kind of entertainment, and others would literally cross the hallway to avoid us, like trauma was contagious. We started eating lunch in the counselor's office just to escape all the staring and whispering that followed us everywhere we went. 3 weeks after moving in with us, I was in chemistry class when the principal's voice came over the intercom saying we were going into immediate lockdown, and everyone needed to get away from windows. My stomach dropped because lockdowns only happened for real threats, not drills, and I grabbed my phone under my desk to text Zoe, who was in English, down the hall. She texted back that someone saw her dad's truck in the parking lot and called the office, and my hands started shaking so bad I could barely type back. We stayed crouched under our desks for 40 minutes while cops searched the whole school and parking lot, but by the time they got there, his truck was gone, just tire marks showing he'd peeled out fast when he saw the police cars coming. The principal said over the intercom that the threat was clear, but we'd have early dismissal. And when I found Zoe in the hallway, she was crying and shaking, because she knew he'd violated the restraining order, which meant there'd be a warrant out for his arrest now. Tony called us that afternoon to confirm they'd filed the violation report, and every cop in the county would be looking for him. But that didn't make us feel safer because we knew he was out there somewhere watching and waiting. That same week, the first medical bills started showing up in our mailbox. Thick envelopes from the hospital with numbers that made my mom's face go white when she opened them at the kitchen table. The emergency room bill alone was $12,000 for me, and that didn't include the surgery to fix my ribs, or all the follow-up appointments for wound care and x-rays. Zoe's bills were even worse because she'd needed emergency surgery on her wrist, plus a 3-day hospital stay for observation after the head trauma, and the total between both of us was pushing $30,000. My mom spent hours on the phone with insurance companies and the hospital billing department, trying to set up payment plans while I watched her stress eat crackers and take notes in this spiral notebook she'd started keeping just for medical stuff. Dana called to say we could apply for victims' compensation, but it would only cover maybe 60% if we were lucky, and the rest would be on us to figure out somehow. 2 days later, Elliot called while we were doing homework to say they'd arrested Zoe's dad at a bar across town on the restraining order violation, plus all the pending assault charges from the original attack. We both cried with relief, but Elliot warned us he'd probably make bail again within a few days since his brother kept putting up money, and sure enough, 3 days later he was out again with a new court date set for next month. Dana showed up at our house the next morning with appointment cards for a trauma center that specialized in domestic violence survivors, saying we both needed to start therapy right away for the nightmares and panic attacks we'd been having. Neither of us wanted to go because talking about it made it feel more real, but Dana said it was required if we wanted any chance at the victims' compensation money, and honestly, we were both falling apart trying to deal with everything alone. The trauma center was in this old building downtown with security doors and cameras everywhere, and the therapist was this quiet woman who let us just sit there for the first 20 minutes without saying anything. She gave us worksheets about trauma responses and coping mechanisms, and Zoe actually started crying when she read the part about how abuse changes your brain chemistry and makes you feel like you deserve it. We went twice a week after school, taking the bus downtown because my mom was working extra shifts to pay for everything, and slowly we started talking about the nightmares where he was chasing us, or the panic attacks when we heard loud noises. A month after the attack, Zoe went in for surgery to properly set her wrist since the emergency room had only done a temporary fix that night. I sat in the waiting room for 3 hours, reading the same magazine over and over, texting her foster parents updates since they couldn't get off work, watching other families come and go while I waited alone. When they finally let me see her in recovery, she was still groggy from the anesthesia, but she grabbed my hand and started crying, saying she still loved her dad even after everything he'd done. She kept saying she was a terrible person for missing him, for wanting him to get help instead of going to prison, and I held her hand and told her that loving someone who hurt you didn't make her bad, it made her human. The nurse had to kick me out when visiting hours ended, but I came back every day until they discharged her with a new cast that would be on for 6 more weeks. Carl Erickson, the attorney the court appointed for Zoe, met with us at the courthouse to explain her rights in all the legal stuff that was happening. He was this older guy with glasses who talked really slow and kept checking his notes, explaining that since Zoe was 17, she had some say in where she lived. But the state wouldn't let her go back to her dad no matter what she wanted. He showed us all these custody papers and court documents, explaining that her dad's parental rights were being challenged by the state because of the violence, and Zoe would have to decide if she wanted to fight that or let it happen. Zoe just sat there staring at the table while he talked, and I could tell she was overwhelmed by all the legal words and decisions she had to make about someone she still loved, despite everything. A week later, the prosecutor called Dana to say they were offering Zoe's dad a plea deal to avoid trial. 5 years in prison with possibility of parole in 2 if he completed anger management and substance abuse programs, plus a permanent no-contact order with both of us. Dana came over to explain it to us, saying it was actually a decent deal considering some domestic violence cases got less time or just probation, but to me 5 years felt like nothing compared to him almost killing us. The prosecutor needed to know if we supported the plea or wanted to push for trial where he might get more time, but also might get less if the jury felt sorry for him, and we had 2 weeks to decide. Zoe spent those 2 weeks going back and forth, writing lists of pros and cons, calling Dana at all hours to ask questions about what trial would mean. She didn't want to sit in a courtroom and describe everything that happened, didn't want to be cross-examined by his lawyer who would try to make it seem like she was lying or exaggerating, but she also wanted him to face real consequences for once. I told her I'd support whatever she decided, but watching her struggle with choosing between protecting herself and wanting justice was one of the hardest things I'd ever seen. Dana suggested we try a support group for abuse survivors that met at the community center on Tuesday nights, saying it might help to hear from other people who'd been through similar stuff. We showed up to find a circle of chairs and about 10 other people, mostly women but a few men too, all looking as nervous as we felt. The facilitator had everyone share as much or as little as they wanted, and hearing other people describe years of violence and fear made us realize we weren't alone in this. Zoe actually talked for the first time about how the abuse started when she was little, how her dad would apologize and be nice for weeks after each incident, how she learned to hide bruises and make excuses for broken bones. Other people nodded and shared similar stories, and by the end of the meeting we'd exchanged numbers with a few people our age who really understood what we were going through. 2 months after the attack, Maya finally called with good news about finding Zoe a foster placement with a family who specialized in trauma cases and had experience with teenagers who'd been through violence. They lived across town but still in our school district, which meant Zoe wouldn't have to change schools on top of everything else she was dealing with. We met them at Maya's office, this couple in their 40s with grown kids of their own, who seemed genuinely kind and patient when Zoe barely spoke during the whole meeting. They showed us pictures of Zoe's room in their house, a small but clean space with a lock on the door that only she would have the key to, and promised they understood she needed time and space to heal. The night before Zoe moved in with them, we stayed up until 4 in the morning in my room. We sat on my bed surrounded by the few things she owned, folding and refolding her clothes just to have something to do with our hands. She kept thanking me for saving her life, and I kept reminding her about that board she swung at his head when he had me pinned. We made promises to stay best friends no matter what happened next, both of us scared that living apart would change everything. The foster parents picked her up the next morning, and I watched their car disappear down my street, feeling like someone had ripped out part of my chest. Living apart hit us harder than we expected. We texted constantly throughout the day, but it wasn't the same as having her right there when the nightmares came. I worried about her being alone with all those dark thoughts that crept in at night. She worried about me dealing with my mom's stress over the medical bills that kept coming. My mom tried to hide the collection notices, but I saw them piling up on the kitchen counter. 3 weeks after Zoe moved to the foster home, we had to go back to court for the plea hearing. Dana met us outside the courthouse and walked us through what would happen. Zoe's dad stood up in his orange jumpsuit and actually admitted what he did as part of the plea deal. His voice was flat and emotionless as he described stabbing me and beating Zoe. The words came out like he was reading a grocery list, not confessing to nearly killing his daughter and her friend. Zoe needed to hear him take responsibility, even though we both knew he didn't mean a word of it. The judge accepted the plea and sentenced him to 4 years with credit for time already served. He'd get mandatory anger management and substance abuse treatment in prison. 4 years wasn't nearly enough for what he did, but at least Zoe wouldn't have to testify and relive everything on the witness stand. Dana said we were lucky to get that much since domestic violence cases often got lighter sentences. 4 years felt like forever when you're 17, though. 3 months after the attack, my ribs finally stopped hurting every time I took a deep breath. The knife scar on my chest was still red and raised, an ugly reminder every time I changed clothes. Alana had told me during a follow-up appointment that it would fade to white eventually. Just another scar to add to the collection from that day. Zoe's foster family turned out to be really good people who actually cared about helping her build a future. They helped her apply for independent living programs since she'd turn 18 in a few months. She filled out applications at their kitchen table, determined to make it on her own instead of aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. I sat with her sometimes, helping with the paperwork and watching her plan for something beyond just surviving each day. School became a whole different challenge for both of us. We couldn't concentrate during standardized tests, our minds wandering to that day, or jumping at every loud noise in the hallway. Our counselor got us accommodations for extra time on tests, and a quiet room to take them in. Dana kept encouraging us not to give up on college even though it felt impossible to think that far ahead. The victim compensation finally came through 4 months after the attack, covering about 60% of the medical bills. My mom sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, setting up payment plans for the rest. I got a part-time job at a grocery store to help with money since the whole mess was my fault for getting involved. My mom told me to stop saying that, but the guilt ate at me every time I saw her worried face. Therapy actually started helping us process what happened once we stopped fighting it. We learned about trauma responses and why our bodies reacted certain ways to triggers. The therapist explained why we jumped at shadows and cried at random moments. Understanding the science behind PTSD made us feel less crazy for not being able to just get over it. Zoe's foster mom started teaching her to drive in their old minivan. Her dad had never let her learn, another way to control her and keep her dependent on him. I went with them sometimes, sitting in the back seat while Zoe gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. She was terrified at first but got better with each lesson. Watching her check her mirrors and signal her turns, actually in control of where she was going, made something loosen in my chest. She was going to be okay. We both were, even if it took longer than we wanted. The foster mom was patient when Zoe stalled at stop signs or forgot to check her blind spot. She never yelled or made Zoe feel stupid for making mistakes. It was the first time I'd seen an adult teach Zoe something without making her feel small. After a month of practice, Zoe could drive around the neighborhood without panicking. She even parallel parked successfully between two trash cans they set up in an empty parking lot. Every small victory felt huge after everything we'd been through. Spring came and we practiced walking across the stage for graduation, the school gym hot and crowded with all the seniors rehearsing. Zoe's foster mom helped her pick out a dress that covered the scars on her arms, while I wore long sleeves under my cap and gown, even though it was 80 degrees outside. The actual ceremony happened on a Saturday morning, and my mom sat in the third row taking pictures with her phone, while Zoe's foster family brought flowers and a big sign with her name on it. They called our names alphabetically, and when Zoe walked across that stage to get her diploma, her foster mom stood up and cheered so loud everyone turned to look. I watched Zoe smile for real, not the fake one she'd been wearing for months, and when my turn came, my mom was crying and clapping at the same time. We threw our caps in the air with everyone else, and I noticed the empty seat where Zoe's dad would have been didn't make her look around anymore. After the ceremony, we went to lunch at a diner, and Zoe's foster parents gave her a card with money for college inside, telling her they were proud of how hard she'd worked to finish school after everything. 2 weeks later, the acceptance letters came from the community college, and we both got in with enough financial aid to cover tuition and books. We filled out the paperwork together at my kitchen table, choosing the same English class for our first semester, so we'd have at least one class together. My mom helped us figure out the online registration system, and we picked morning classes so we could work part-time in the afternoons. The financial aid office sent us each $1,000 for books and supplies, more money than either of us had ever had at once. Summer passed with both of us working and saving money, Zoe at a coffee shop and me still at the grocery store, counting down the days until school started. In July, 6 months after that terrible day, Maya called to say Zoe qualified for independent housing through a program for kids aging out of foster care. The apartment was tiny, just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it had a deadbolt and a chain lock and windows that locked from the inside. We spent a whole weekend moving her stuff from the foster home, buying cheap furniture from thrift stores, and setting up her new place. She hung curtains her foster mom made, and I helped her put together a bookshelf from a box, both of us sweating in the summer heat. When everything was set up and the foster parents had hugged her goodbye, Zoe sat on her new bed and cried. Not sad tears, but relief that she finally had her own space where nobody could hurt her. The bad days still came without warning, like when a car backfired and we both hit the ground in the college parking lot, or when Zoe woke up screaming from nightmares about her dad finding her. We had each other's numbers on speed dial and called during panic attacks, talking each other through breathing exercises the therapist taught us. The medication helped with the worst of it, little white pills that made the world feel less sharp and dangerous, though they made us tired and gave us dry mouth. Weekly therapy sessions became part of our routine, sitting in those uncomfortable chairs and talking about things we wanted to forget but couldn't. When the 1-year anniversary approached, neither of us wanted to spend it crying or hiding in bed. Zoe suggested doing something different, and we drove to the beach before sunrise, bringing paper and pens to write letters to ourselves from a year ago. We sat on the cold sand and wrote about surviving and healing and being afraid but doing things anyway. I wrote about being sorry I couldn't protect her better, and she wrote about forgiving her dad, even though she'd never tell him. We dug a small pit in the sand and burned the letters with a lighter Zoe bought at a gas station, watching the smoke disappear into the morning sky. The fire was tiny, but it felt important, like we were letting go of something heavy we'd been carrying. 2 days later, Dana called while I was at work to update us on Zoe's dad's status in prison. She said he was participating in the required anger management and substance abuse programs, hadn't violated any rules, and hadn't tried to contact us through third parties. His earliest release was still 2 years away, and by then we'd both be 19 with our own lives. Dana reminded us the no-contact order would stay in effect even after his release, and any violation would send him back to prison. College started in August, and we met other students in our English class who'd been through their own bad stuff, though nobody's story was exactly like ours. During a class discussion about personal essays, one girl talked about her mom's boyfriend, and another guy mentioned foster care, and we realized we weren't as alone as we'd thought. The campus had an advocacy group that met Thursday nights in the student center, survivors helping other survivors recognize warning signs and get help. We started going to meetings, and after a few weeks, we shared parts of our story, keeping the worst details private but talking about recognizing abuse and getting out. 6 months into college, we were different people than we'd been a year ago. Most nights we actually slept without waking up scared, though we both still checked our locks multiple times. We made friends who didn't know about the attack, people who knew us as college students and not victims. The scars were still there, mine across my chest and arms, Zoe's on her wrists and face, but they'd faded to pink lines that didn't hurt anymore. We studied together at the library and went to parties sometimes, and even dated people who treated us well. Every single day we chose to keep going, to trust people again, to build something better than what we'd survived. Well, that was definitely a journey to share with you all. Kinda makes you look at things a little differently, right? Thanks for sticking around with me. Like the video, it helps more than you think.